Welcome back to A Celtic State of Mind. I'm Paul John Dykes, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Craig Leitch. And this is Acsom with a bit of a difference, Craig, because as anyone can see, you are a Hibs fan and you're on A Celtic State of Mind, but there's a good reason for it. You were a regular contributor to a show that was on A State of Mind called The State of Scottish Football. And what used to intrigue me about that show, watching it back, was the way that Hibs fans, Hearts fans, Aberdeen fans, fans of other clubs viewed us as a football club, us as a fan base. And I thought, you know what, it would be interesting to get some of the opposition fans involved in this charity weekender. So welcome to the show. How you been?
Thanks for having me, mate. No, it's been good. I think this is, even though I've done the State of Scottish Football for a while, it's the first time that we've actually done anything together. So, no, I'm looking forward to it.
We are sharing a screen for the first time, and you know there are parallels between the histories of both clubs. Many players have played for both clubs. I'm going to ask you about some of that as well, but just a wee bit of disclosure for myself. I remember after the miners' strike in '85, my old fella got a job in Bilston Glen, and we moved through to Midlothian. We moved to Pennycook, in actual fact, and I was surrounded. I think there was 2 or 3 Celtic fans at the school, but I was surrounded with Hibbies and Hearts fans. And you know, I don't think there was a single Rangers fan in the whole school, certainly not in my class. But most of my mates were all Hibs fans, right? And you know, because you're bored and your old man's working away a lot of the time, I would go to Easter Road quite a bit, not as a Hibs fan, I've got to say, just to watch a game of football. And I seen a great, what I thought was a great side in the 1980s, and it was guys like John Collins, Paul Kane, Joe Tortolano, Willie Miller, Gordon Ray. Up top for a while, we've seen players like Stevie Archibald, Keith Houchin signed for them. And I know a wee bit about the Hibs history, but sometimes Hibs fans who are pals of mine wind me up and say that, you know, Celtic stole a bit of the old Hibs history and they stole the hoops and all that kind of stuff. Is that tongue in cheek? Is that something that Hibs fans are quite vehement about?
I think, I mean, obviously it's well before any of our times. I think that both clubs were set up at the time to help, you know, a disadvantaged population within the community that had travelled over from Ireland. You know, obviously Hibernian's the name, I believe it's the Gaelic or Roman name for Little Ireland. So, you know, I think there's a bit of, I don't think necessarily there's bitterness. I do think, you know, when you read the stories, it's, you know, there was always the chant, if it wasn't for the Hibees, you'd be the H word. So I do think there's a bit, it can be a bit tongue in cheek, but I do think there's a bit of, probably on both sides, a bit of rewriting the history to, you know, to sort of suit both sides. Obviously, we were the first to wear the green. We were the first to have the green and white hoops.
Yep.
But no, I do. I mean, to me, it doesn't. It's not a massive thing to me. You know, more when you think about it, both clubs were set up for the right reasons, which was to help the disadvantaged Catholic population that lived in Edinburgh, firstly, and then obviously 12, 13 years later through in Glasgow for Celtic. Sorry, the Catholic population in Glasgow. So, it's probably a bit of both, I'd say, a bit tongue-in-cheek and a bit of maybe green-eyed jealousy at seeing the comparative, you know, journeys of both clubs since then.
Yeah, and you know the thing with that is when I'm massively into Celtic history. I know football fans, not everybody is into the history of the clubs, but I delve into that. And obviously, my latest project was looking at the jerseys, and I seen that Hibs jersey, and you know, obviously we've taken the hoops at a certain time in our history, 1903, changing into the green and white hoops, and it's something that stayed with us. But there's other things as well throughout the history of both clubs with regards to certain players and managers, obviously. The big one being, of course, Jock Stein moving from Hibs to Celtic in 1965, and things were never the same again for Celtic. You know, the European name that they became was down to the team that Jock Stein built. It was down to the standards that he set. And when, as a Hibs fan, you look back to that and you see what he did at Dunfermline and you see what he did at Celtic, and that short period in between times, is there ever a moment where you think, what if he had stayed with Hibs? And, you know, he could have rewritten history if he had stayed with Hibs, because wherever he went, he made it happen, didn't he?
I think, obviously, my granddad, who's no longer with us, he used to talk a lot about that sort of era, the famous fives, the famous five era in the 50s, and, the name in Europe that Hibs became at the time. Obviously, they were the first British club to compete in European competition. By default, it doesn't matter. They were still the first team there. And, that period sort of between the famous five finishing and then the Turnbulls Tornadoes and the sort of late 60s transitioning into the early 70s, there was all, and I used to, like yourself, I used to love sitting listening to him tell the old stories about the old players, Eddie Turnbull, Willie Orman, Joe Baker, all of they types. And he would always reference Jock Stein as a case of the one that got away, because there was a real belief. I think he was only maybe at Hibs for a year, maybe not even as long as a year. But I believe that his tenure at the club was relatively successful. And there is, and amongst that older generation of fans, I do think that they do maybe look back on that as a case of what if. Probably wouldn't have managed to, get the level of success that Celtic did, in terms of winning the European Cup, and then almost, I think, was it the year after he's got to the final again? Almost won it again 2 years ago.
1970, yeah, 1970.
Aye, so 2 within 3 years. I don't think that would have happened, but we certainly maybe would have been sitting with more than 3 league titles and 3 Scottish Cups in our trophy cabinet.
Yeah, I mean, there's a thing as well. I have the discussion quite often with Jim Orr, who's got a real admiration for fans of clubs who don't win something or don't even expect to win something every season. And as a Celtic supporter, there's been really dark periods, going to watch the club as a season ticket holder during that 9 in a row era where Rangers were winning 9 in a row and Celtic almost went out of business. But, generally speaking, throughout my life, other than that wee spot, that decade, Celtic have been pretty dominant, and you go into seasons and you think, well, what's my expectations? I want to win the league. I want to win at least one cup. And you feel a bit spoiled sometimes when you then speak to fans. Like you say, there are 3 league wins, 3 Scottish Cup wins. And I do look back on that era. And one of the players that Jock Stein got to know during his time at Hibs, he actually tried to sign on for Dunfermline, was Pat Stanton. And Pat finally came to Celtic at a time where he was coming to the end of his career, and he came to Celtic and ended up winning the double with the club. Jock Stein had tried to sign him for the Pars. He eventually signed on for Celtic. He knew how good he was because he had worked with him at Hibs. But Paddy Stanton, he's a Hibs legend, but every Celtic fan that you speak to who's seen him playing, every player that played alongside him, they hold him in such high regard. Just how big of a legend is Pat Stanton for Hibs fans?
Oh, I think he's still, obviously we've got Frank Sawsey, who sort of my generation refer to as Le God. But for that older generation, Pat Stanton is, he's God around Easter Road. It's funny you bring him up, actually. I was, the luxe of working from home, trailing through YouTube, trying to find something on the background to keep me occupied. And it's actually the anniversary of the Turnbulls Tornadoes winning the League Cup in '72 against Celtic. And I've seen it in the past, but I've never really paid much attention to it. And Hibs put maybe a 15, 20-minute video on YouTube. It must have only been for the second half. And I'm just going to sit and watch it. And you hear the names: Jimmy Johnston, Kenny Dalglish was playing, Billy McNeil. And then on the Hibs side, you've got like Blackley, O'Rourke, who we sadly lost recently, and Pat Stanton as well. And I was watching it and I couldn't believe I was watching a game for 50 years ago. It's easy to, there's always this tired debate about, could Pele have played in this era, or could so-and-so have played in that era, and, who's better, Messi, Ronaldo, Maradona, blah, blah, blah. But it's the first time I think I've watched an older game of football. And actually, even though I knew the end result, I was almost mesmerised by what I was seeing. And I don't know if it's maybe because we're in a state of flux at the moment that I'm looking at it thinking, I wish we had a player in the midfield like that. Yeah. Because he was just everywhere. I mean, he was absolutely everywhere. Obviously, he scores, sets up the second for Jim O'Rourke as well. He was in that 15, 20-minute clip. I don't think he was ever not shown. He was just everywhere, and he's certainly held in amongst the absolute highest of regard by by Hibs fans, to the point where I don't think many of them grudge that he got to go to Celtic near the end of his career, like you say, and win the double.
Yeah, it is. It's incredible, and I love looking back at that kind of era because footballers, the way they held themselves, the brill creamed, the slip, but everything was immaculate. And Pat Stanton was that type of player. He comes to Celtic, he wins a double in 1977. And if you ever watch that game back, he's exactly the same. He's orchestrating things. He's, like you say, people think, that was back in the day, but these players were very modern players. And I don't buy this argument that certain individuals from the past wouldn't make it in today's game, because I actually think they'd be better, Craig, because I think that given the sports science, given the dietary kind of requirements of a footballer now, it's not as though they'd be in the modern day still living like it was the 50s or the 60s. They would have everything at their disposal. And I think that they would be even better. That would be my argument. They'd be even better than they were back in the day. Now, there are legends. And Ronnie Simpson, who won the European Cup for Celtic, had played with Hibs. Bertie Auld wins the European Cup for Celtic. He ends up going to play and manage Hibs. And in the kind of the more modern times, there's been loads of Celtic players who have come from Easter Road, and I want to talk about a couple who, one of whom played in a very poor Celtic side, but he was an absolute class player for both Hibs and Celtic, and another who came to Celtic and got loads of glory. The first one's John Collins. Now, I always remember Collins. He had played for Celtic Boys Club, but he made his name at Hibs, and he was one of those guys that there was two things. You just wished he would sign for Celtic, and you hoped that he never ever signed for Rangers, because he was just class. And I don't know if history's been rewritten a wee bit because of he's maybe got a different kind of relationship with the Hibs fans from his time as a manager. How do Hibs fans view John Collins now? Because I think him as a player at Easter Road, the guy was superb.
I think it's easy to separate the player and the manager aspect. I mean, I'm old enough to remember him as a player, but no as a player at Hibs. But I think with any player that comes through the youth academy at Easter Road and goes on to achieve a level of success, like John Collins did in his career, both, with the way that he went, he went abroad and he went, scored against the reigning world champions at France '98. There is a belief that he was almost ahead of his time as a player. And you could probably argue he was maybe a wee bit ahead of his time, or possibly stuck in when he was a manager at Hibs, it was that weird. He was so forward thinking in terms of the dietary, the sports science side of things, but it was almost like he was trying to manage like he would have been managed back in the 80s, 90s. In terms of his man management style, there's that famous story about him on his first day at Easter Road taking his top off and going, "This is what you should aspire to," and pointing at his six pack. That's one of these urban legends that's grown arms and legs. I've heard for some that it's true. Some same sources close to the scene that say it's not true. But no, I don't think it's a case of history being kind. It was, from what I've read, based on fans at the time, he was a great player for Hibs. And like I said, you always keep a keener eye on these ones that do come through the youth academy, and then obviously, sadly, another one that's lost to the Bosman era, and somebody that decides to hop on the 900 along the M8.
See the thing, I do want to talk to you about that, because as a Celtic supporter, you either bring a player through or you manage to find a talent of a certain age. And there's always this niggling feeling in the back of your mind that one day a richer club, some people say bigger club, I think a richer club comes along and takes them from you. And, recent examples are people like Victor Wanyama, Virgil van Dijk. And Celtic have done it deliberately. They've brought the players in. That's the model. And we know that someday we're going to sell them on. But also the guys that have come through over the years, like people like Charlie Nicholas came through. We lost them to Arsenal. And, most recently, Kieran Tierney comes through. And we lose him to Arsenal as well. Aidan McGeady, the same thing happened with him. But to kind of like a similar degree, Hibs have got that issue, because you can rear a young player. Is it in the back of your mind that pretty quickly Celtic or Rangers are going to come in and buy them off us?
I would say so. I mean, you think that it's Celtic and Rangers obviously look beyond what can they do in the Scottish League. you see the same issue down in England now as well, with players trying to buy English players because of the rules for Europe, whether it be the Europa League, Champions League or whatever, having that quota of homegrown players in your squad. There's always that feeling that they will, if we have a player that's performing at the top of his game, the most recent one, probably John McGinn, and that whole summer was Celtic, coming in from it wasn't happening, then it was going to happen, then it didn't happen. There is, you do kind of get that feeling that there is always going to be the opportunity, purely because they know that, even if you take Ryan Porteous, for example, this January, for Celtic or Rangers, he's probably, he's a low risk investment type because he's homegrown, but also because he's played over 150 games for Hibs. He knows the league. He's lower risk than Celtic's overall strategy, which seems to be looking towards that sort of Asian market. You look at I think he's got a centre half coming in for Japanese already. But you weigh up the two, you could argue that Porteous would be more low risk because you almost know exactly what you're getting. He's played at Ibrox, he's played at Parkhead, Tynecastle, he's been in those intimidating atmospheres and he knows how to do it. So hopefully, fingers crossed, he doesn't follow the rest that have made that journey along the M8. But it's always, I think it's the same for every club, whether it's Hibs, Hearts, Aberdeen, Dundee United. As soon as anybody decent comes along, you have that kind of idea in the back of your mind that one of you will be circling round anyway.
Yep, and it is interesting because as Celtic fans, and when we start talking about budgets as well, it's kind of similar because we feel the same with the richer clubs, and then that disparity in finance, we feel kind of similar when we're in the Champions League. But how can we complain, because we've kind of got that monopoly once we come back to the domestic game. So I do appreciate the other player I was going to mention, actually, when I was talking about Johnny Collins, was a player that played under him when he was a manager at Hibs, and that was Scott Brown. And I always remember Bruni as a Hibs player, and I really fancied him, but I also liked Kevin Thompson at the time. I thought he was a very, very useful player in the midfield. And to be honest, at that point, I wasn't seeing enough of Hibs to know what would have been the better signing. Obviously, one of them goes to Rangers eventually, one of them comes to Celtic. And we kind of snipped Rangers to the signing of Scott Brown. And he turned out to be an absolute legendary figure at Celtic, which at the time, when you watched, when you look back at when Gordon Strachan signed him, if you had predicted that, I think most people, if Acsom was around at that time, we probably wouldn't have predicted that, Craig. The type of player he was. I don't think he had issues with his temperament, to be honest with you, at that time. But he certainly had development in him. He had to develop as a player and as a character, and he did that. He became one of, and this is maybe something that will only be accepted in years to come, one of the most iconic captains. You just got to look at what he won for the club, 9 in a row, 4 trebles. And he's become an absolute Celtic legend. And when I look back on that at £4.5 million, he repaid that time and time again, note for note. But when I'm looking at that time, that was a Hibs side that was really breaking up. And I sometimes wonder, what if that group of players from that era were to have stayed together, Craig? Do you ever think back at what they could have achieved for Hibs?
Oh, all the time. I think the thing at the time was that it was meant to be Scott Brown was meant to go to Rangers and Kevin Thompson was meant to go to Celtic. At that period, so I was about 13, I think, when Tony Mowbray was appointed, and that is maybe bar 6 months under Neil Lennon. That's probably my favourite time supporting Hibs. That side was just full to the brim. You had O'Connor and Riordan up top, and even then we had Stephen Fletcher coming in at the back of them. We had Brown, Thompson and Boozy in midfield, Whittaker and Murphy at fullback. Like, I can reel off that team like, my elders can reel off the Turnbulls Tornadoes team. And it's Scott Brown was the one that, I remember his debut. He came on as an early substitute against Aberdeen, I believe, at Easter Road. And I'm sure he scored. And he started as a striker.
Right.
He was a striker when he started. And then the Mowbray's first season, he transitioned more out as a wide player, playing on right midfield, because he had bundles of energy. Like, he was the player that left Hibs, I never envisaged would become the player that he became at Celtic, because at Hibs he was all action. He was everywhere. You only need to go back and see when we beat Rangers at Ibrox, when Sproul scored his hat-trick. For the second goal, Brown picks the ball up, maybe about 35 yards out of the goal, away on the touchline, mind, but about 35 yards out, and he smokes Lovenkrands. Now, Lovenkrands himself was an absolute whippet, and Brown just leaves him for dust, like he's not even there. And then to see the player, there was always I think a point of discussion between Hibs fans is that we wished he would have went down south, because I felt personally that he could have played at a high level in the Premier League. Maybe not necessarily starting every week for Man United, but I think the player that he was at Hibs, he could have held his own in that company. As he's shown in Europe for Celtic as well at times. But I know that era of being a Hibs fan was special, and I suppose the only result that I regret is we didn't win anything. But my own personal view is that if we'd kept that team together for one more season, one more full season with Mowbray at the helm, I reckon we could have made a good stab at it. Like maybe we wouldn't have won anything, but I definitely think we could have pushed Celtic and Rangers close, because we went to both stadiums in that period of time, and there was a 3-1 game that sort of started the tide for Helicopter Sunday. Ironically, Scott Brown scored that day as well. But no, I definitely think that if we'd have kept it together just for one more year, and I spoke to Gary O'Connor about this, and he said that if Petrie had just loosened the purse strings a wee bit, they would have stayed.
Would have made all the difference. And the thing with Bruni, the wonders of social media, that particular goal that you just described there, where he leaves Lovenkrands for dead, it popped up on my Twitter not that long ago, and I remember looking at it going, wow, that's a different player. The Scott Brown you're describing here, it was a different player to the one that we grew to love at Celtic Park. Some of the names that you're mentioning, I will come back to them, but just on that note, you're talking about that team. There's also a group of players, and I think even in the current World Cup that's not yet finished, Jason Cummins playing for Australia, it's another reminder of the level of talent that's been at Easter Road, that they did achieve a lot, but you wonder if they achieved their full potential. You mentioned Gary O'Connor. He's one that I'm thinking about. I'm thinking about the likes of Derek Riordan, Tony Stokes. I know he wasn't a product of your youth academy, neither was Leigh Griffiths, but obviously he also played there. And they're guys that have virtually gone off the rails. And I've asked Hibs fans before, is there something in the water down at Easter Road there? Because, these guys could have achieved just about anything. I remember Riordan as a young player at Hibs, and he was a skinny laddie. Of course he was, his physique in that probably wasn't right. But you think to yourself, when Celtic signed him, I remember Strachan saying that Riordan was the best finisher at the club, but there was just something missing, for him to transition from Hibs to Celtic. It didn't work out for him. As a Hibs fan, when you're looking at the talent I've just mentioned there, the ones that didn't quite achieve what you think they should have done, is there a frustration there as well? Can you explain why it happens so often?
I think in my own eyes, they played for the club that they loved numerous times. Between them, they've probably got over 150, 160 goals combined. I just think it's, when you look at where they're from, O'Connor's for Port Seaton, Riordan's for Pilton, Griffiths is for Magdalene. They're council estate laddies that got to go somewhere that somebody for their area doesn't get to go to.
Yeah.
And whether you can argue the company that they keep or, their own mentality. I mean, you still, O'Connor made it to the Premier League. They were all capped internationally. Griffiths ended up playing in the Champions League. I believe Riordan did as well. I think Riordan scored a penalty against I can't remember who it was, but to get you through. So I think there's you could probably argue that Griffiths done the best at a lot of them, considering he's, when you look back on the medals at the end of the career, it's Griffiths that'll probably be ahead of them. But for me, they were just council estate laddies that made it big. And they got to play for the club that they loved. They got to score goals for the club that they loved. They managed to, making an appearance for their country. And I don't know, I think if you could ask them all if they'd trade it all to win something with Hibs, even Griffiths and the enormous success that he had at Celtic, I think it'd be a close call if they give it all up just for that one chance to be part of that, that elite that won the Scottish Cup in 2016.
It's interesting because I always think of the ones that didn't achieve enough. And actually, when you put it like that, it's almost as if they achieved a lot more than they should have done, because you look at the background and their upbringing and the environment that they came through in as well. But just one last word on Griffiths. I mean, he's a frustrating character for Celtic fans. It wasn't that long ago he was given a 1-year extension by Ange Postecoglou. He's now on the soccer scrap heap. What can you see the future holding for Leigh Griffiths?
I mean, Lee's a hard one. I mean, he's got, again, he's probably the one that, I lived in near the area that he was brought up in, so you can, not while it's, the term working class probably doesn't exist as much as it did, 20, 30 years ago. But that's an area where you can probably still leave your door open. Everybody knows each other. And I just think that Leigh got himself into certain scenarios that he now looks back on and wishes he didn't get himself involved in. And you could argue that maybe did he reach his peak at Celtic? Once players or once an individual gets to a certain limit in their life, what else is there aim for? Mm-hmm. Griffiths grew up supporting Hibs, he'd done that. He wanted to play for Scotland, he'd done that. He would have wanted to win the Scottish Cup as a kid, he'd done that. The League Cup, score at Tynecastle for Hibs and a win, he'd done that. Score it, when he went to Celtic, one of his objectives would be to score at Ibrox and a win, he'd done that. So really what more? The 2 goals against England as well, even though Scotland drew, that's the thing is with moments like that for Leigh Griffiths, nobody can take it away from him. And it's whether that is enough for him. Can he sit and look back on his career and go, do you know what? Folk can say what they want, but I actually done all right.
Yeah.
And it's sad because there's always that sort of, I don't know if Celtic fans get the same, but when you see players that have came through your academy and go elsewhere, so Scott Brown, Stephen Whittaker, Kevin Thompson, Gary O'Connor, Derek Riordan, all of them came back. Apart from Brown, Scott Brown never came back. But there's always that, do you know what, see if we can get them at the end for a year or two, just as a farewell, just to sort of, bring the memories for 10, 12 years ago back again. Griffiths would have been that one. There was a clamour for Hibs to go for him in the summer when Postecoglou gave him his 1-year extension.
Yeah, yep.
And then obviously the off-field stuff happened and it was just a complete no-brainer for that. But the fall-off has been pretty... I don't think our players fell off as quick. Considering the level drastic. That
yeah,
he has.
Yep.
I mean, I know he has suffered off the field stuff, with his mental health, and it just goes to show you that all the money, all the trophies, all the adulation in the world doesn't mean anything if you can't fight with your demons. And maybe he's chosen that he'd rather look at himself and look after himself than try and find a high that'll obviously never come again, because he'll never reach the level of playing for Celtic. He'll never even reach the level of playing for Hibs again.
No, it's unfortunate. You're talking about players coming back. Do you think we'll ever see Scott Brown back, maybe in the dugout in the future?
I think any time there's going to be a job opening up, well, I mean, you see it with Kevin Thompson. He gets linked with a Rangers job or some sort of role at Rangers, because he likes to eat the blue pound every now and again, despite saying he's a lifelong Hibby. But who knows? He's got Whittaker as well. There'll be a chance. It depends how well he does it at Fleetwood. If he does well at Fleetwood, then I think there'll be that clamour. I mean, I've seen it. I was reading the forums today. Somebody still wants John Collins to come back as a director of football. So I think that feeling, I think it's just a sense of familiarity. If you know that you've got someone, like I mind when John Hughes was appointed, and he was probably the first player that I grew up watching that became the manager, and there was almost that feel like he gets it. Do you know what I mean? He knows the club. He's a fan. He gets it. So you never know. There's a chance. I would say I hope not, because it means Lee Johnson will be successful. But the way things are looking now, that link might come sooner rather than later.
Yeah, I'm sure it will be spoken about in the future as well. But another player, sorry, manager, I'm familiar as a player as well, but who was at both clubs is Neil Lennon, of course, and he was a manager at Celtic twice. He also had a successful spell at Hibs. And I remember when Hibs appointed Neil Lennon, thinking to myself, the only other club outside of Celtic in Scottish football that would suit Neil Lennon would have been Hibs. I remember thinking that when he got the job. When you look back on it, you've already mentioned, you enjoyed his tenure. Was it soured by the way it ended in any way, Craig?
No, definitely. I mean, I think there's a lot of misty-eyed nostalgia that goes back when you look at Lennon's tenure at Hibs. I mean, the Championship season that folk reference, we'd had Hearts and Rangers the season before, then we'd had Rangers. So there was no way we weren't going to come back up. So that season was almost a needs must. And, we pulled off a masterstroke in the January by, somehow managing to send Simon Murray away and swap him with Scott Bain to go to Celtic, and it meant that we got Scott Allen to come back to Easter Road. And that 6 months, the midfield three of Allen, McGinn and McGeoch with Canberry and McLaren up top was magic. I mean, I think the way that they played, it was almost like gung-ho at times. Mm-hmm. As evident, we beat Kilmarnock 5-3, second last home game of the season, and then we had to win by 6 to finish second against Rangers, and we were 3-0 up in 21 minutes. It was just madness, and that game sort of encapsulated, Lennon doing the person that Lennon is. If your team goes 3-0 up and ends up 5-3 down, you would never imagine somebody like Lennon to be on the park doing aeroplanes after a last-minute equaliser, but you could probably temper it with the opposition that day as well. Mm-hmm. For Lennon at Hibs, I mean, for me, it started to fall apart even before that. We played Hearts away at Tynecastle after the split, and he totally changed the system. We were absolutely flying, and he changed it, and we ended up getting beat. And he came out after the game and he went, I don't know what I can do with these players. I don't know if I can do it anymore. And he went AWOL for about 3 or 4 days.
Right.
And you always knew there was that element with him. I mean, I know he's described as a fiery character, and this argument that he doesn't help himself gets flown about a lot as well. But he's another one who's had to put up with a lot mentally. Whether it be, I couldn't even imagine what it would be like to get bullets in the post. But I'm pretty sure that if I had a nappy on, it would be absolutely full when I opened that envelope. And, that type of character is always going to need managed at times. Mm-hmm. But that's when the cracks started to show. And then the way it just sort of unravelled, it's almost like we've still not recovered from it. That summer losing John McGinn was a heartbreaker. We've not recovered for that. We've still not found someone to replace John McGinn in the centre of the park. And that's like finding a needle in a haystack at times. Sometimes you just get a player who fits the mould. And McGinn done that for the 3 years that he was at Hibs. But no, there's elements of Lennon's tenure that I do look back on and I think, that was class. And then there is elements that you look back on and you think, it wasn't far off the shark fences getting thrown at him at Easter Road like it was at Park Craig during the COVID season.
It's interesting, the parallels, isn't it? I mean, you've got that burst of success and adulation and momentum, and then, as you say, that unravels at the end. And, Neil Lennon's a guy I'm pretty sure will be back in the game at some point. I'm just not sure if it will be in Scottish football. You've mentioned John McGinn a couple of times. I remember the first time I ever seen him playing. It was for St Mirren at Celtic Park. And he was a 17-year-old laddie. He was brilliant. He ran the show. And we won the game, but I remember thinking, at this stage, why don't we buy a player like him? Mm. And I know that a lot of guys haven't transitioned well from other Scottish clubs. One of the other talents from St Mirren, of course, was Lewis Morgan. Didn't quite work out. But it's low risk. It's like what you're talking earlier about Ryan Porteous. And I remember thinking that he, of course, went to Hibs. And then there was that whole saga when Celtic tried to sign him. And it did put me back in mind of the Stephen Fletcher deal, which I remember trying to get Stephen Fletcher. It was a January transfer window, and we ended up losing the league that season. We never got Fletcher. He eventually signs for Burnley. It was Burnley he went to, wasn't it, after Hibs?
I went to Burnley.
And when you look at the league table and you look at the results, the amount of times we drew and the amount of times we failed to score in the last 8 games of the season, and you think, would Fletcher have made a difference? Probably. And you look at those 2 signings that we failed to get over the line, and you don't know what the politics is really between Peter Lawwell and Petrie, and you think to yourself, was there politics? Were Hibs actually basically saying, we're not going to sell these guys to you? From the Hibs perspective, what do you understand of those 2 deals not going through and Celtic not signing Fletcher and McGinn?
The McGinn one is that just Hibs, they didn't offer what Hibs wanted. And it was a case of Aston. I think John McGinn's even spoken about this himself, about it, that, you know, his granddad was the Celtic chairman, his entire family were Celtic season ticket holders. You know, he's made no bones that, you know, that was where he wanted to go. He told Hibs, that's where I want to go. And at the end of the day, Celtic just didn't offer enough money. Whether it was, you know, at the time, did they look at, could McGinn get in that midfield? I mean, you look back on it now and you say, there's absolutely no, for me anyway, there's no bones about it. He would have played in that Celtic midfield, and he would have played every week in that Celtic midfield. The Fletcher one is interesting because through my granddad, he used to sponsor players at Hibs, and it was Stephen Fletcher that he'd done for me. So at the end of the year, you'd go to the sponsors, get the framed shirt. So for the age of maybe 13 to 17, at the end of every season, I would go and sit with Stephen Fletcher and talk to him. And there was a big thing at the end of the season that he left about how close he was to going to Celtic in the January.
Yeah.
And again, I believe it was just a case of Hibs put up a figure. Celtic didn't want to match the figure. And whether it's, you know, every team's got their own valuation of the player. What valuation to Hibs a player you know, what a valuation of 3 million can do for Hibs versus what does it actually harm Celtic to spend the 3 million? You know, it hurts Hibs a lot more not to receive that than it does Celtic to spend it. So that's, you know, like I say, whether at the time, was there I couldn't even recall who Celtic strikers were at the time when Fletcher was supposed to go. But was it maybe the same agreement with McGinn? Does he get in the side? Does he not get in the side? Why are we going to spend 3 million for somebody to sit on the bench? Because obviously that especially with McGinn, that midfield at Celtic at the time, you know, I think was that just off the back of the Invincible season?
Yeah. But I remember being so disappointed that we didn't sign him. So I think when I look back, I certainly, nobody walks into the side, you know, that's as successful as that, particularly with Brendan Rodgers in charge.
Yeah.
But there was 2 things about that move. The fact Rodgers wanted him so much, and the fact that we were so disappointed that we didn't get him, would suggest that although he might not have walked into that, we could see enough to know that he was definitely at that level, that he would be pushing for a jersey. And, you know, it is a big regret. It still pops up all the time on Acsom, mate, when we're talking about ones that got away. McGinn, not so much Fletcher. I mean, I look at that season, and we had a very, very bad transfer window in the January. We ended up signing Willow Flood that January, and we didn't win the league. And it was one of the ones where you can look at things and nobody knows what would happen, but we were shy in front of goal. Fletcher would have made a difference. I think he went and proved that, you know, just about every club afterwards. In fact, he gave Starfelt a tough time for Dundee United fairly recently as well. So, but McGinn is the one. That's the one that really got away from me. It's interesting the discussion that we're having. There's a few things I want to ask you before you go, right? And this is based on a lot of the discussions we have on Acsom. We constantly talk about the officiating at games because it doesn't seem consistent. And I know, by the way, this has been filmed the day after you guys should have got a penalty, I think, at Ibrox. I don't know what you're thinking about that. But, you know, we constantly go on about no getting decisions, right? And the decisions is going generally Rangers' way. From a different perspective, from a Hibs fan, do you just think, stop moaning, you get more decisions than we do? Or, I mean, what is your view on that kind of perception we have that officials often could be against us or biased for, in favour of another team?
I think you can almost see the arguments on both sides at times. For me, it's a case of welcome to what's been happening to us. I mean, you referenced that penalty decision last night. For me, it's one of those ones. The more I look at it, the more I think it's a penalty. But it's the issue for me is that VAR didn't check it.
Yep.
That was the whole reason that VAR was brought in, was to look at these potential contentious decisions and give a definitive answer one way or another. If it goes to VAR and Nick Walsh goes over to the monitor, looks at it and goes, do you know what? You can't give it if you're not 100% sure, right? So if he's like, if he's on, then don't give it. That's fair. He's had a chance to go and see it again. But the fact that they never even went to look at it again, and then you look at and I'm only referencing this because I thought it was a baffling decision at the time, was the penalty against Celtic for Dundee United.
Yeah.
So for me, it's more, where's the consistency? If that one's a penalty, surely the one that the incident for last night should have been a penalty. And then you go into these arguments about it's different interpretations, it's different, Andy Walker bleating on about some t-shirt line when it hit him on the forearm. For me, it's more the what baffles me more is, I wouldn't expect to get a penalty at Ibrox anyway. Number one. But with VAR in operation, you're expecting them to go and look at it. Get the referee over. The VAR can go, listen, I think that might be. You should go and double check it.
Yep.
The fact that it's not been double checked, or even the game's been stopped and the VAR have looked at it and went, actually, do you know what? There's nothing in that. Play can continue. Whereas they done it later on for a nothing potential handball in the Hibs penalty box. So, I know there's it goes back sort of beyond the modern day, especially when it comes to Celtic. And I'm not a Celtic apologist either, before anybody starts wondering. But obviously you go back to the funny handshakes and the Masons and all of that sort of stuff. Even going back to when the clubs were formed, it was for a minority population within Scotland.
Yep.
So there's always been that sort of, I've felt, us looking up at the establishment and the establishment looking down, which is probably why there's, on the face of it, there seems to be this sort of friendship, relationship, partnership that exists between Hibs and Celtic, and it does between Hearts and Rangers, because of their mostly historical, political and religious leanings.
Yeah.
But for me, it's, you see it every week. If Rangers get a decision given for them, Celtic fans are, it's brother beaten again. If something goes Celtic's way, it's beaten. Madden must have lost their lodge card. They're not getting back in this week. I think it goes both ways. You do think that they will even themselves out over the course of a season, but I do think you find that for us diddies, the rest of us, it errs on the side of not evening itself out more than what it does, as evidenced by last night, by Porteous's red card at Ibrox last season. Those wee things. I think it's more the consistency. I don't think there's a conspiracy. I just think we have hopeless officials right across the board. For me, that's what the issue is.
The standard is so poor. There's one final thing, again, because I'm not as invested as you are in Hibs. I'm watching from the outside looking in. I liked what I had seen under Jack Ross and John Potter. I thought good things were happening. And it's not really been that great since then. I know this is with the strength of hindsight, but at the time, if you go back to that, Craig, what was your thoughts? Did you think it was a bit premature getting rid of Jack Ross?
Yes and no. I thought, he was on a 1-1 in 10. The Livingston game after he got sacked, Paul Hanlon and Paul McGinn had both been sent off. That's your captain and your vice captain, so your two dressing room leaders showing ill discipline the night, in the run up to a cup final. I thought the fact the cup final was on the horizon would be enough to, for me, it was more a case of it got us there.
Mm-hmm.
It deserves the chance to lead us out and see what we can do.
Yeah.
I believe that Ron Gordon bit himself on the backside by sending us into a cup final with David Gray in charge. Any sort of confidence that Hibs would have had in the run up to that was eroded when Jack Ross left. And the benefit of hindsight, we should never have sacked him. I can understand why at the time, but then it rolls onto we should never have sacked Ross, but then we should never have hired Maloney. And then the whole plan with Maloney gets, is unravelled by the end of the season. No, he doesn't even make the end of the season. And then obviously we bring in Lee Johnson, and that's, we're on 7 defeats in 8 games.
Mm-hmm.
But at some point, where does the merry-go-round stop? Because we're going to, you look down south and you see teams like Watford, and they are, you hear about when Michael Beale gets the Rangers job, he's the 18th manager in Rangers history. Postecoglou's probably the similar number here, here or there,
Yeah.
And then you look at Watford and they're on like their 25th manager in the last 12 years.
That's incredible. That's
potentially the route that Hibs are going down because of inept decision-making from the top. There's this argument about Lee Johnson to go now. I don't see the point. I don't see the point in sacking him if we're going to let the same individuals who not only sacked Ross, who not only hired then sacked Maloney, then also hired and potentially sacked Lee Johnson to have another kick at the ball. It's for me, it just this culture that Ron Gordon's trying to build at Hibs. I mean, off the field is magnificent. I mean, we've got I never thought I'd see huge 50-foot screens being installed at Easter Road, but we've got them. The hospitality's been ripped out, revamped. We've got even down to small issues. Like I complained last season that the astro around the pitch looked horrible. Like as soon as the grass stopped, it was just almost like gravel.
Mm-hmm.
That's all been redone. There's been a lot off the field that Hibs have done extremely well. But they've taken their eye off the ball by focusing so much on that and not focusing on what matters to us. I didn't turn up to see what the turnover of the hospitality suites are on a Saturday. I turn up to see my team hopefully win. We're not going to win them all. Obviously, I understand that. But you want to see something. Something like you referenced earlier about, as a Celtic fan, you almost feel spoiled because 9 seasons out of 10, you're going to end up with at least one trophy.
Mm-hmm.
Whether it be the League Cup, the Scottish Cup, the League, whatever it is, more often than not, you'll get at least one of them. Whereas for us, it's more about seeing, just take us on a journey, make us dream a wee bit. You know what I mean? Let us start to, fantasize after 6 games in the league because we've won 6 that we're going to win the league. That we're going to be playing the Champions League music's going to be Easter Road next season. Just let us dream a wee bit. And now it's closer to a nightmare than it is a dream.
It's really interesting to get an insight. It really is, which is the reason I thought it was a good idea for you to come on, Craig. And it's been a real pleasure talking to you about your Hibs state of mind on a Celtic state of mind. It's obviously for a good cause. We're raising funds over the weekend for St Mary's of the Carlton. And if you want to download our new single, The Glory and the Dream, or donate, both links are underneath this video. I've got to say, hopefully we can do it again sometime, Craig. And thank you for joining me on a Celtic state of mind.
No, it's been a pleasure, mate. Thanks very much for having me. I would wish you all the best for the rest of the season, but I wouldn't mean it.